Welcome to What the F is Going On in Latin America and the Caribbean, CODEPINK's weekly YouTube program of hot news out of the region. In partnership with Friends of Latin America, Massachusetts Peace Action, and Task Force on the Americas, we broadcast every Wednesday. Today we're coming to you on Thursday, generally Wednesdays, but always 4:30 p.m. Pacific, 7:30 p.m. Eastern on CODEPINK's YouTube channel. We can now also be found on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. Today's episode, Biden Summit Fizzles Out. I'm joined by my CODEPINK Latin America teammate and Leonardo Flores, who is our Latin America policy expert, and he is our co-host, guest, and friend of honor today. Welcome, Leo.
Oh, thanks so much, Terry. It really is an honor to be here because you've had a lot of high-profile guests over the last couple of weeks, so I think I might be the lowest profile one.
No, not at all. And most important, we're teammates and friends. So it's always great to be in conversation with you. So
absolutely.
So for our audience, we're going to talk about a lot of things today, and but all with a common thread. So we're going to talk to you about a series of events that have been unraveling since early May here in the hemisphere of the Americas, in advance of US President Joe Biden's Summit of the Americas, which is scheduled to take place in Los Angeles, California, June 6 through 10. So let me just introduce some of these events that have unraveled. We've seen the publication of Trump's Secretary of Defense, Mark T. Esper, the publication of his book, A Sacred Oath, Memories of a Secretary of Defense During Extraordinary Times. That was published on May 10. Also on May 10, the president of Mexico announced he would not attend Biden's summit. And he said, press conference Tuesday morning, May 10th, that if they are not all there, I will not go. And of course, he was referring to the exclusion of Cuba, Nicaragua, and Venezuela. The president of the United States had not invited those three countries to his summit. So this, I think, and it's also really important for us to couch this as a protest and not necessarily a boycott, although that may be coming. What also has happened is the appearance of easing US sanctions policy against Cuba and Venezuela. And then on May 18, 23 visas were denied to a Cuban civilian delegation that was hoping to attend the Alternative Peoples Summit in Los Angeles. Also on the 18th, here in Mexico City, a US Summit of the Americas delegation led by Christopher Dodd met with the Mexican government with no results. Simultaneously, in the background to all of this happening here in the Americas is the surrender of Ukrainian troops and the Azovstal in Ukraine. So, Leo, we've got a lot of things in this soup in the Americas right now. So maybe let's start with Esper's book and the irony of some of the disclosures in that book, specifically the disclosures he makes about US regime change in Venezuela, and how ironic that is, given the reasons why Biden has excluded Cuba, Nicaragua, and Venezuela to his summit.
Yeah, I mean, there are some really scary things in Esper's account. And I think the first thing to keep in mind is that Esper kind of portrays himself as the guy who doesn't want war. So here we have the most dovish, for lack of a better word, person in the administration who happens to be the defense secretary, which is a little insane. But what he recounts is that it was the National Security Council that had been pushing for a military option in Venezuela throughout 2019 and 2020 until he was fired, basically. And the key person being Mauricio Claver Caron, who was the senior director for Western Hemisphere Affairs of the NSC, the National Security Council. This guy is now the president of the Inter-American Development Bank. And yet what Esper recounts is that he was basically potentially in on the plot to plan and finance Operation Gideon. And Operation Gideon was this kind of mercenary invasion that happened in May 2020. I think it was May 5th, if I'm not mistaken. Mm-hmm. And the plan there was to have, there were 2 US Marines that came in with a bunch of Venezuelan expat mercenaries and they were going to infiltrate the country on speedboats and then go to Caracas and kidnap Maduro, or possibly kill Maduro. And, when the news first came out that this thing was foiled, you saw a lot of skepticism in the media, and they're like, oh, there's no way that this was real, or that the US was involved in it, or, that these were just some like crazy guys if this happened at all. But now in hindsight, after we saw the president of Haiti, Jovenel Moise, murdered by mercenaries, US trained mercenaries, Colombians in this case, and in which, we have evidence that there were US actors involved, and US people who had been agents for the US involved in the plotting and carrying out of Moise's murder. I mean, to me, it's really shocking that there hasn't been more investigation into just how involved the US wasn't in terms of this plot to assassinate or kidnap President Maduro. And he recounts several conversations in the Oval Office. At one point, he asked Guaido if if Trump had asked Guaido, rather, if they wanted US military assistance to overthrow the Maduro government. And he kind of demurred, but kind of said yes, but didn't want to outright say it. And Esper quips
with body language, yes.
Exactly. And Esper quips in his book that really what Guaido and this Venezuelan opposition, these fascists, what they wanted was for the United States to fight to the last American in Venezuela, which is kind of a parallel to what's going on in Ukraine, where the United States now wants to fight to the last Ukrainian against the Russians, right? So yeah, it's a scary book, and really scary chapter, because of what it reveals. And it also, there are parts of this that are redacted because I guess the Pentagon didn't want some of this stuff getting out. But he talks very clearly about how, once these military options were not being considered as much, they switched to talking about less direct options, like cyber operations and covert operations. They even talked about attacking a Venezuelan port. And I bring this up because, again, we saw a cyber attack on Venezuela's electric grid in 2019. We had this U.S. Marine named Matthew Heath. He was arrested outside of an oil refinery. I think this was September 2020, if I'm not mistaken. Arrested with, surveillance equipment and grenade and explosives and weapons. So clearly there was something up, and there's a lot to this when the Venezuelan government says, and time again, that they foiled plots by the US. What we get from the corporate media is immediate skepticism that, oh, this couldn't possibly be true. But now we have the defense secretary saying, oh yeah, there were all sorts of shady things going on in Venezuela at the time.
What's so ironic to me is that he uses it to discredit the then president of the United States, versus really just framing it, just coming clean that this is US foreign policy and this is how it's implemented. And it's really...
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the other things he talks about is, he decries the militarization of foreign policy, and how during the Trump administration, the first instinct was always to use the military as basically using the military as first response rather than as a last response, and criticizing the Trump administration and the Trump team again and again for doing this. And at one point, I know you talked about Mexico last week, and too bad this book didn't come out in time for last week's show, because he says that Trump wanted to bomb Mexican drug labs in Mexico with missiles. And then when he was told that this would be an act of war, that it would damage the relationship with Mexico, that it would damage US global standing, then Trump kind of ponders it and he says, well, how do they won't know it's us. We'll just send a couple of Patriot missiles and we won't tell them it was us, and nobody will know.
They just say made in the USA on them.
Exactly. So this was kind of the dangerous level of discourse that we had going on at the White House. And while I'm always very critical of the Biden administration's approach to Venezuela, where he's maintained these deadly sanctions, I think that is kind of one of the key differences, right? I don't think these military options are discussed as much as they were during the Trump administration, which was a small mercy, I suppose.
There's something you mentioned earlier about in the meeting with the White House staff and the former Secretary of Defense and Guaido, that the presumption was the body language, the innuendo in the conversation was that, and I think this was in response to the constant questioning, well, if there's a US invasion, if the US funds an invasion to Venezuela, will the Venezuelans fight? And there was never any sort of direct answer to that. And the presumption was that the invasion would be fought to the last, as you said, the last U.S. troop. And I know you and I have talked about this for many years, and when referring to the Venezuelan opposition, but not the entire Venezuelan opposition, to be fair, but that for there to be a violent coup, a military invasion, any sort of incursion of that nature, you would see opposition, specifically the Guaido segment of the opposition, all of those people sitting in Miami and watching the incursion on CNN from Miami. They would not physically be there, nor would their sons or daughters or any of their family be on the ground.
They would absolutely, and it's really, for the most part, it's almost the same thing with the sanctions, right? The biggest cheerleaders of the sanctions on Venezuela are Venezuelans who don't live in Venezuela. They're living very cushy lives, either in Madrid or in Miami or in New York, and they're saying, no, what we need is more and more sanctions. We need to collapse the Venezuelan government, to strangle the people, and that's the only way out. And by out, they mean that's their only way to power. And of course, they're not the ones suffering. And by this point, you know, when they had that meeting where the military option was discussed, this was after the April 30th, 2019 coup attempt by Guaido, where, you know, early in the morning, I got a phone call. It was like, oh, there's a coup attempt in Venezuela. And I looked online and I couldn't find anything. And then I called a friend and it's like, no, there's nothing going on. Things are calm. And then finally we saw on Twitter that, you know, it was kind of staged, that they had taken over a highway or overpass in Caracas, and they were pretending like they had taken over this key airport just to see what the response would be of the armed forces, if they would join them. Obviously, nobody joined them. And I think that's the key here, right? That I think the Venezuelan opposition, the extremists, have known all along that there is absolutely no appetite within the opposition for a civil war, because they don't have the people. They claim always to represent the majority of Venezuelans, that the majority of Venezuelans are always with them. But this is totally false. And I think eventually it kind of sank into the Trump administration too, that these people don't have the majority, that there's no way that that they could possibly be successful in overthrowing the government without direct U.S. military aid or intervention.
So they would fight to the last U.S.
Absolutely.
And it's always that demographic, isn't it? I mean, the wealthy people, that 1%. So you mentioned that this demographic that lives outside of Venezuela is very pro-sanctions. They're not, they have the finances. They're not suffering, at least certainly not the direct impact of sanctions. Perhaps family and friends back home are, but they directly are not. Let's talk about U.S. foreign policy, sanctions as U.S. foreign policy, sanctions, and I would also argue as sanctions as hybrid warfare, and in that sense, a form of military policy as well, because it isn't just Venezuela. It's been Cuba for almost 70 years, and Nicaragua on and off since the 1980s, and now definitively with the enactment of the Renaissance Act last September, or just before the presidential elections in November of 2021. So in the lead up to this Summit of the Americas in September, weeks away now, we have seen, I guess, sort of, what the appearance of relaxing sanctions, blockade against Cuba, and perhaps the lessening of sanctions regarding the oil industry in Venezuela. Can we talk a little bit about that?
Oh, absolutely. And before I go into that, in the first question you asked, the second half, which was how does these revelations by Esper kind of affect the Summit of the Americas, or how do they relate? Well, I mean, to me, when we talk about the Summit of the Americas and why the United States is looking to exclude Cuba, Nicaragua, and Venezuela, the answer they give is that these are countries that don't respect the Inter-American Charter, which is one of the founding documents of the Organization of American States, and that they don't respect democracy or human rights. But what Esper reveals is that they never cared about Venezuela's democracy. They don't care about Venezuela's human rights, and that they're trying actively to overthrow the Venezuelan government, which is a direct violation of the Inter-American Charter. So this is just empty rhetoric that the United States is using for political reasons. And the political reason being that they need the votes and the money that comes from Florida. And they don't want to cede this policy position, or they don't want to cede Florida just to extreme right-wing Republicans. So they're trying to outcompete them in their efforts at regime change. But all of this is kind of backfiring. And then all of this, I mean, is this exclusion of these three countries from the Summit of the Americas is backfiring, because as we've talked about on the program before, you've had, countries in the region are saying, no, we're not going to attend, led by Mexican President Andrés Manuel López Obrador. I think the list includes now Honduras, Bolivia, many countries in CARICOM, and usually CARICOM sticks together. So if, I think there's going to be a consensus in CARICOM not to attend, and I would imagine that almost every country in the Caribbean is not going to attend. And by not going to attend, I mean not sending their president or prime minister. They might send a lesser diplomat to attend.
Yeah. And Guatemala too. Guatemala,
yeah, Guatemala and Brazil, but for slightly different reasons. Guatemala more for political reasons, because the U.S. is very critical of their new attorney general, and the Guatemalan president wasn't having it. And Brazil, I think Bolsonaro hasn't been clear on why he's not going to come, but it's probably related to the elections in the campaign that he's got going on in his own country, and because I think he'll know that he'll face massive protests whenever he goes outside the country. This is a guy who is despised throughout the hemisphere. So in the face of this kind of backlash from Latin America, from the Caribbean to Biden's Summit of the Americas, well, he's had to start kind of a charm offensive. And now we're seeing, a relaxation of sanctions on Cuba. And this has been welcomed by many of us who are in the Cuba Solidarity Movement, but welcomed with a caveat. And the caveat being, this is a very, very small step, right? So among the sanctions that the Biden administration recently eased were about visas. Now the consulate in Havana, the US consulate, is going to be more staffed, and they're going to start issuing visas. Limited number. So there are going to still be many Cubans who are going to be forced to travel outside of their country in order to get a visa to the US. There's going to be steps towards family reunification. They added flights to they lifted the ban on flights from the US to cities other than Havana. They eased some restrictions on group travel. They also eased some restrictions on e-commerce. So maybe we'll see Zoom being unblocked in Cuba, for example. And they also eliminated the limit on remittances. Again, that comes with an asterisk, because they still maintain their sanctions on FinCEMEX, which is the Cuban agency associated with receiving remittances. So unless that is lifted, what we're going to see is, okay, there's no more limit on how much you can send, but you're going to have all these kind of shady operators taking remittances and then taking a huge cut, maybe 15, 20% of these remittances going towards these private corporations, whereas through FinCEMEX, it was a very tiny percentage of the remittances being captured. So, I mean, it is a positive step, but I don't think it's nearly going to be enough in order to convince, for example, Mexican President Andrés Manuel López Obrador to come to the summit. And then similarly, we had a gesture of sorts towards Venezuela. It's unclear yet how to interpret this, because the AP reported that the lifting of the sanctions, I don't think there's been official word yet on what the actual lifting of the sanctions are, but the AP reported that the Biden administration is going to allow Chevron to renegotiate its license with Venezuela, with the state-owned oil company, but they're not going to allow them to resume operations. And they also lifted an individual sanction on a former oil executive who's presumably going to be handling the negotiations with Chevron. And that was this kind of a sticking point over the last several months, was that Chevron had nobody to talk to because all of the oil executives had been sanctioned by the US. So talking to them would have been illegal under US law, which is obviously ludicrous, right? But one of the things that's a little odd about all of this is that the US claims that this was done with the unitary platform's blessing, the unitary platform being the latest iteration of the opposition coalition that features, the more extreme factions. And yet they came out with a statement not long afterwards saying that they had categorically denying that they had called for lifting of a personal sanction. So there's already infighting with the opposition because of this decision, right? And
which is
then,
nothing new, the infighting among the
oh,
opposition.
absolutely. I mean, yeah, I should
That's
have mentioned
historical.
that. I mean, it's so historical that to me, like, it's just obvious, but maybe for some of the listeners that they don't know that the Venezuelan opposition is just split into many, many, many different factions. And that's
Well,
part of the
Mike
problem.
Pompeo eventually figured that out.
Yeah, that's true.
It took him several years.
And then, but on the Venezuelan side, we got a statement that was significantly more hopeful. We had Delcy Rodriguez, the vice president of Venezuela, say, she tweeted this out, and I'm kind of paraphrasing. She said, the Bolivarian government of Venezuela has verified and confirmed the news to the effect the United States of America has authorized US and European oil companies to negotiate and restart operations in Venezuela. So negotiate and restart, which would be a very significant change, a very important change in order for Venezuela to get its economy, back on track. It's already kind of on track, but certainly a lifting of oil sanctions would make the economy, go off like a firecracker in terms of growth, and would really help Venezuela, overcome its deficits in healthcare that has seen its healthcare system decimated by the sanctions. So it's curious that there's kind of this disconnect between what's been reported and what the Venezuelan government is saying. And I think maybe the truth is somewhere in the middle, that,
Sure.
when it comes to the European oil companies, there's no sanction to lift per se, only the threat of secondary sanctions. Secondary sanctions being this idea that if a company outside the US does business with Venezuela, then the US can just take it upon themselves to issue sanctions on that company. But so maybe there's been kind of a back, channel discussion that the Biden administration is now telling these companies that they're not going to be subject to secondary sanctions. That's, educated speculation on my part, but we'll see what comes out of it.
Well, do you think this for the European oil companies, is this a Biden overture towards them for having destroyed European trade with Russia regarding energy?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think what we're seeing is that Europe is going to have an energy crisis, and that, because of sanctions, say, on Iran, and it's still difficult for them to acquire oil, and then Venezuela presents a very obvious opportunity for them to get new oil. I think that's why, in part, why the Biden administration sent representatives to Caracas the first time in 20 plus years that the White House had sent someone to Caracas to negotiate with the government. Because of this oil crisis, the gas prices going up so high, both in Europe and in the US. I don't know if, the oil decisions are affecting, if the Biden administration is considering lifting sanctions because of gas prices here at home. I think if that had been the case, they would have done it maybe a month or two ago, because, these things take effect. There's a kind of a lag time. So between now and the elections, I'm not sure how much oil Venezuela could contribute to the US necessarily, but certainly for Europe in the medium term, given the conflict between Russia and Ukraine, access to Venezuelan oil would be tremendously helpful for them.
But expensive to ship it across the Atlantic.
It's expensive. It's certainly more expensive to ship it across the Atlantic than to just ship it straight to the Gulf of Mexico, which is where most Venezuelan oil used to go.
Yeah. What, oh gosh, how much of this, we're talking in terms of, this change in policy regarding US and Venezuelan oil, but how much of that, we're counting it in terms of consumer prices in the States and for Europe, but how much of this decision do you think is pressure from like Chevron and other US-based oil companies that they perhaps are losing market share, global market share?
Yeah, absolutely. So Chevron is typically kind of, when you see corporate reporting about this, they name Chevron as being the only oil company doing business in Venezuela or with oil fields in Venezuela. And that's not quite true. There's many others, companies that provide services related to oil, like, for example, Halliburton. So there definitely has been pressure from Chevron, from some of these oil companies, to lift the sanctions. Specifically, just before leaving office, actually, the Trump administration let a license that Chevron had gotten. They let this license lapse, preventing Chevron from doing business in Venezuela. Before, they were still being able to do business, but instead of, it was kind of an oil for debt type swap, where instead of getting paid directly with money, for this oil, what Venezuela was doing was paying down debt that it owes to Chevron. And this debt issue, and this is a slightly different issue, there are many bondholders in the U.S. who have Venezuelan bonds that haven't been able to be paid, and I know that they're also putting a lot of pressure on the administration to lift some of these sanctions so that they can get their bonds reimbursed.
Yeah, kind of like what happened in Argentina a number of years ago with those vulture funds. Same scenario kind of setting itself up, possibly. So with Cuba, with Venezuela, we're seeing perhaps lifting this relaxation, of sanctions from the Biden administration towards Cuba and Venezuela, but still no formal invitation from the president of the United States to the president of Cuba or the president of Venezuela or the democratically elected president of Venezuela. The stand-up faux U.S. puppet will perhaps be invited. He hasn't been invited yet, has he? There's pressure from Florida.
Yeah. Right. And you're referring to Juan Guaido, the so-called interim president, the puppet. No, I mean, you have the extreme right wing, Marco Rubio, pressuring for Guaido to be invited. But if Guaido goes, then certainly there's going to be a massive boycott from Latin America. So I think that's going to be a non-starter. But no, we haven't seen any indication that these leaders are going to be invited. My theory is that the Biden administration might cave on Cuba because the Obama administration had put so much emphasis on the renewed ties with Cuba and the restoring of relations, and because it's seen as though Cuba is somehow the least objectionable of these three countries, and that the Biden administration might be able to weather the storm. So I think they might try to divide and conquer in the sense of maybe they'll invite Cuba but keep the bans on Venezuela and Nicaragua, and then forcing a difficult decision for some of these countries like Mexico and Honduras and Bolivia. But I don't know that that's going to be the case, because it's getting pretty late in the day in terms of, the Summit of the Americas is supposed to start on June 6th in LA. And by, mid-May already, these countries haven't received invitations. In fact, it's not even clear that any invitations have been sent out because the president of Guatemala said that he hadn't been invited yet before he claimed that he was going to boycott it. So they're not exactly on the ball at the State Department in terms of inviting countries.
Wow.
Yeah,
they don't know what they're going to do.
Yeah, absolutely. So everything's pointing to this Summit of the Americas being a total, a fracaso, a total blunder, a failure, right? And that to me, is really curious, because what isn't going to be a failure, what has been drawing a lot of attention from social movements and organizations and people on the ground, is the alternative summit, which is going to be the People's Summit for Democracy, going to be held in LA, where the official summit is as well, and it's going to be held from June 8th through 10th.
And where is that going to be for our audience?
Yeah, that'll be in downtown LA. I don't know that the exact address has been published yet, but it's going to be an amazing program. People should go to the website, which is peoplesummit2022.org. And once you're in there, you can see all of the organizations that have endorsed. It's a wide range of organizations that work on regional issues, and also a lot of unions and tenant unions and human rights organizations, workers organizations. It's going to be fantastic, and the program is looking excellent too. You have a lot of panels and plenary discussions with some very important thinkers from all around the hemisphere, and from youth leaders and activists. So we're going to see a lot of participation from the people themselves. But unfortunately, one of the things we won't see is Cubans who had been invited by the People's Summit, 23 Cubans specifically, including, a designer of one of the vaccines, the COVID-19 vaccines, an Olympic bronze medal winning wrestler, a queer Christian student leader in Cuba. They're one of 23 Cubans who got their visas denied by the Biden administration to travel to the People's Summit. And my question is, what are they afraid of? What are they afraid that these Cubans are going to say at the summit that's going to be so damning to the Biden administration? And we know what it is that they're going to say. They're going to say that the embargo is real and it is incredibly cruel. And on top of the embargo, there were another 243 sanctions imposed by the Trump administration, which the Biden administration has yet to lift. He lifted some of those earlier this week, but there's still at least 200 plus sanctions that he could lift tomorrow with the stroke of a pen, but he's refusing to do it. And so it's quite a shame that the Cubans have not been invited. And in fact, we've started a petition at CODEPINK to press the State Department to rescind, to go back on this decision and actually admit those visas. If you go to codepink.org/Cubans banned, you will be able to sign our petition calling on Secretary of State Blinken to grant these visas.
Tweet that out. I'll tweet that out as we talk. One of the things, so it's 23 Cuban civilians. It was a civilian delegation. And those visas will not be issued. So we're, like you said, let's sign the petition and put some pressure on the US State Department to issue those visas. One of the really important things that has not been discussed in this easing overture towards Cuba is lifting the US designation of state sponsor of terror, which is currently how Cuba is designated in Washington.
Yeah, and it's a step that the Biden administration, I believe early on they said they would consider it, but we're a year and a half into his tenure, and we've heard nothing yet. And for folks who don't know the backstory, this is really a totally absurd designation. So Cuba was on the state sponsor of terror list for many years until I think it was 2014 under the Obama administration.
Yes.
That they were taken off the list because the Obama administration rightfully recognized that Cuba does not sponsor terrorism. And in fact, it's the other way around, that Cuba has been a victim of terrorism. Sponsored, if not abetted by the United States, in fact. But then the Trump administration came in and applied its so-called maximum pressure policy against Cuba. And they put Cuba back on this list using the worst of possible excuses, right? So according to the United States, and this was actually at the petition of the Colombian government. So according to the US, Cuba was put back on the list because they currently have former Colombian guerrillas in Cuba that they refuse to extradite. Well, the truth is that Cuba was a host of peace talks between the Colombian government and the FARC, the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia. And as a mediator in those peace talks, they signed this long agreement that included that the negotiators of the peace talks wouldn't be subject to deportation or to extradition, that would basically, that Cuba would guarantee their safety. Well, now Colombia, because there was a change in government, and because the new government led by Ivan Duque, who's doing terribly in terms of approval rating in Colombia, he wanted those Colombians, former guerrillas, back because he wanted to prosecute them. And the Cubans said, no, we can't, because this is our duty under international law to protect them, because we accepted these negotiators and we promised them that we would guarantee their safety. So now, because Cuba is obliging by its international commitments, it's being put on this list of state sponsors of terrorism. Oh, wow. And it's such an absurd designation that politicizes this list, which I don't know that it makes any sense to have such a list in the first place if it's just going to be used for political motives. But the fact that Cuba's on here is totally egregious, and it's something that really that's one of the few things that Biden couldn't do right away with the stroke of the pen. He would have to order a study first, and so it would be like a 3-month gap. But he still hasn't done it, and it's not clear if he's ordered this study. So it's a real shame. What it's showing is that the State Department and the Biden administration, they're politicizing issues just like the Trump administration did. They're trying to divide Latin America and the Caribbean just like the Trump administration did. And while there may be differences in approach or in rhetoric, specifically, contrasting what we heard with Esper and with Trump talking about all options on the table, whereas the Biden administration seems to be kind of leaning away from that. In effect, in real terms, there's very little difference between Trump and Biden administration when it comes to foreign policy in Latin America and the Caribbean.
The window dressing's different.
That's right.
That's about it. Yeah. They've changed the curtains, and well, one pulled them all the way back. Well, yeah. So what else should we talk about? What else? I just want to remind the audience that I have put into the Twitter, to my Twitter feed, the link to the CODEPINK alert about issuing the Cuban visas, and also the peoplesummit22.org website. I'll put those in YouTube too, for those of you watching on that channel. I guess for me personally, Leo, it's really just in closing our conversation, kind of threading the needle as we watch you sitting in Washington, D.C. and me here in Mexico City, how so much is unfolding across the hemisphere of the Americas. And you and I have talked about this before, and for our audience, I consistently bring this up, so I'm sorry if I'm boring you, but I do think it's really, really important. The words that the president of Mexico had to say July of last year on the 238th anniversary of Simón Bolívar's birth, and he's made specific comments about the need to not necessarily completely abolish the OAS, but to revamp it so that there is an institution in the Americas reflective of all of the Americas. And then he hosting the Venezuela dialogue in August, and then the reconvening of CELAC in September of 2021. And to me, what we're watching now unfold, really this arc of events since July of last year, and now seeing perhaps no invitations to the Summit of the Americas, or if they do go out, a very exclusive group of countries being invited, which of course is antithetical to exactly what AMLO talked about last summer. There really is this arc that's been laid out, and specifically, I would say from here in Mexico City, led by the current president of Mexico, and his rebuffment, or his, saying I'm not going to Los Angeles in June, really is just one more event. And to see so many countries follow his example, his leadership, I mean, I think we really are seeing, a whole series, not just this month of May, which has been filled with all kinds of stuff, but a real timeline of things unfolding. And it's, in a way, it's inspiring. It's hopeful, I guess. Maybe that's the right better.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's really great that AMLO has taken these positions during his tenure. I mean, the first very difficult decision, or maybe not so difficult for AMLO because he's so principled, was rejecting U.S. pressure to recognize Juan Guaido as president. He never did that. He always maintained his recognition of President Maduro. And that was a sign that, Latin America wasn't just going to fold to the pressure under the Trump administration or now the Biden administration. So he really right now is carrying the torch for regional integration in Latin America and the Caribbean, given how kind of weakened, say, Cuba, Venezuela, and Nicaragua have been from the sanctions, given the coup in Brazil, the loss of Ecuador on the left. And now we're kind of seeing a resurgence of the so-called pink tide with Bolivia, possibly Colombia, the left winning in Colombia, the left winning in Brazil, the left one in Argentina, obviously. So we're seeing that we're going to see a resurgence, I think, of the pink tide, and or excuse me, of this push towards greater regional integration and this push for multipolarity in Latin America, in the Caribbean, and it will be greatly expanded if the left wins in Colombia and Brazil. You already had Lula talking about creating a currency for South America called the Sud, and you have China talking about expanding the BRICS. So there are all these things going on kind of at a geopolitical level that point towards waning US influence, not just globally, but particularly in Latin America and the Caribbean. And this is something that's kind of been happening for 20 years now, for 23 years, I'd say, since the first election of Hugo Chavez. And now we're seeing that it's not just dependent on one person or one country, that there are going to be other leaders who are going to step up, like AMLO. And that's extremely welcome, because it's only through that multipolarity, it's only through regional integration that that Latin America and the Caribbean can hold fast against these pressures that come from the United States, whether it's economic or military, diplomatic pressure. If it's just against one country, with that country is likely going to fold. With the exception of Cuba, that was doing it alone for many, many decades, but it's hard to withstand pressure. And when we saw a lot of pressure come on to specifically the Caribbean over the last couple of years in relation to Venezuela, and so AMLO gives everyone just some breathing room to make decisions based on their own foreign policy, based on their own sovereignty.
Their own sovereignty, that's the key word. So let me kind of in closing, just throw out a thought. And it's kind of a curveball, but a nice one. So you mentioned multipolarity, and that was a big theme in the CELAC summit, September of last year. It was came up with, regardless of the politics of the country, speaking the multipolar integration of the hemisphere and the ability to, through CELAC, to perhaps interface with the rest of the world. So basically, calling for a multilateral, at the very least, multilateral trade, but also politics. Do you think that that is perhaps the real end game, and through diplomatic measures, is perhaps the real goal here in protesting this year's Summit of the Americas, is to kind of, and I ask that because AMLO was so specific in his 24 July discourse last summer. His closing statements, he quoted George Washington, actually, talking about the Organization of American States, and that perhaps it's, no longer effective, and there needs to be a body that's, as we said earlier, that represents an America for all Americans. And it kind of seems to me that that's the push that's going on here. One is to recognize the sovereignty of each individual nation within the hemisphere of the Americas, and to just get rid of the whole Monroe Doctrine in practice and in historical paradigm of the United States.
I really do think that AMLO's decision to not attend if Cuba, Venezuela, and Nicaragua are not invited is intimately linked with this issue of multipolarity. And it's also linked just to international law and the principles of non-intervention and non-interference, right? Because the United States,
which is a chapter in the OAS Charter too.
Absolutely,
a section.
Absolutely,
it's one of
the founding principles of the OAS, actually, and yet the U.S. constantly interferes. So, the United States has a responsibility to invite every country in the hemisphere to this summit. This isn't getting an invite to the summit isn't a prize. It isn't something that is that countries have to earn. It's every country has to be invited, because these summits are meant to talk about regional hemispheric issues, like, say, the pandemic, or human or migration, or jobs, or the environment. And how can you talk about these things if all the actors aren't present, right? And the U.S. has a responsibility to invite them, just like the U.S. as host of the United Nations has a responsibility to accept every diplomat from every country in the United Nations. They don't always follow that, but they're much better at the UN than they are with the OAS and the Summit of the Americas. And AMLO's decision is totally linked to multipolarity, because I think the region has had enough of being bullied by the United States. They've had enough of this false rhetoric, of this weaponization of the terms democracy and human rights to really mean, in practice, only what the US wants, right? Because it's not actual democracy or actual human rights that the United States wants. It's democracy and human rights according to a very narrow definition, if and only if it also serves US interests. Yeah. So, I think I think we've seen a massive change in the region in terms of how it relates to the United States. And AMLO is, the next step in that change, and this push for multipolarity is going to be key, and that's going to be the only way that these countries can preserve their sovereignty.
the possibilities are very inspiring.
Yeah.
And to see it playing out on the diplomatic stage is really encouraging. I mean, that's leadership by example versus by gunpoint. And it's very, very inspiring and very, very
Oh, that's right.
promising.
And in a way, really, I think Biden's kind of dodging a bullet, and if AMLO goes, because I can almost guarantee that AMLO is more popular in LA than Biden, and that he would get many, many, many more people at his speeches than Biden would.
That's for sure. That is most definitely true. So for our audience, let's remind them you can protest Biden's Summit of the Americas in LA by attending the People's Summit, 2022.org. You can find out more information there. And also, please, let's get the 23 Cuban civilians to that summit in LA also. And you can find that Code Pink alert. I just tweeted it out to all of you, but let me pull it up again. Codepink.org / you know it, you wrote it.
Codepink.org/Cubans banned. Yeah, I mean, it's so egregious because the US always talks about representing Cuban civil society and looking out for the interests of all Cubans. And yet when you have this broad, group of people that do represent every level of Cuban society, the US says no, because we don't want to hear what you have to say.
Yeah, it's all very managed, just like the media, all of it very controlled. So thank you, Leo. It's always so great for you to join us as a guest and co-host and friend. I love our conversations. So
me too, and best of luck in Colombia next week.
Oh, that's true, folks. I will be leaving for Colombia in several days, and so you'll be seeing some WTF, at least if not full episodes, some video shorts from our electoral observation delegation there. So thank you, everyone. I just want to remind you, you've been watching What the F is Going On in Latin America and the Caribbean, Code Pink's weekly YouTube program of hot news out of the region. We broadcast weekly, generally on Wednesdays, 4:30 p.m. Pacific, 7:30 p.m. Eastern, and on occasion, Thursdays or Fridays. And you can also find us on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. Also, be sure to catch Code Pink Radio every Thursday morning, 11 a.m. Eastern on WBAI out of New York City and WPFW out of Washington, D.C. That program also can be found on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. So everyone, we'll see you next week. And thank you again, Leo. It was a terrific conversation and great to share some time with you.
Anytime, Terry. Thank you.
Okay, everyone, we'll see you next week.